Okay, this is lesson 5. We are covering chapter 16 tonight. This is a bit unusual. This weekend, next week's class, we are covering only one chapter each class. Sometimes we've covered 4 and 5 chapters. Many of the questions in both of these lessons are very simple. Chapter 16 is a pivotal chapter in the book. It introduces David as the king. The first half of chapter 16, which is verses 1 through 13, ends with a statement concerning David's reception of the Spirit of God and describes David being anointed as ruler of Israel to replace Saul. The second half of the chapter, verses 14 through 23, begin with a statement concerning Saul losing the Spirit and that spirit being replaced with an evil spirit. It also describes David's arrival in the court of Saul. So it shows us not only the transfer of the divine blessing from Saul to David, if you will, but also the beginning of the displacement of Saul by David as king. The setting is Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a small community 6 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Here's Bethlehem. This is the Dead Sea, the Jordan River. There's Ramah, where that's Samuel's hometown. Here's Gibeah, which is Saul's hometown. Here's Jerusalem, which was not technically Jerusalem at this time, but nonetheless, that's about, get my cursor again, that's about 6 miles southwest a little bit of Jerusalem. There's Bethlehem. And so Bethlehem was the hometown of Boaz, who married Ruth, and Boaz and Ruth were David's great-grandparents, and this is where David and his family still lived. First section is called the Anointing of David. It covers the first 13 verses. I'll give a pause here and let you look back over that if you hadn't prepared for it. Shouldn't have said it that way. But anyway, if you want to refresh yourself on it. So question 1 says, what had the reign of Saul demonstrated about the kind of man the king of Israel would need to be? Well, it demonstrated that God was looking for a man who would submit to him, a man who would be obedient to his will. And that's perhaps best stated, or certainly well stated, in chapter 15, verse 17, where Samuel approached Saul after the issue with the destroying the Amalekites, but sparing the best of the flocks and sparing the king. Samuel said to Saul, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. Let me check some. Another translation says, when you were little in your own eyes. And the point seems to be there that when you were humble, when you didn't think you were something great, God appointed you as king over Israel. Question number 2 asks, who was David's father? Well, his name was Jesse. And then it says, where was he from? Which tribal territory? He was from the tribe of Judah. This will be asked again and discussed a little more detail in chapter 17. It's brought up again. But it asks here, why are these facts important in light of Genesis 49, verse 10? Well, Genesis 49, verse 10 was Jacob's inspired prophecy to his son Judah. He made the statement that, quote, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. A scepter was a staff or a rod that symbolized royal authority. A lawgiver, of course, is one who issues statutes or laws. This was a prophecy that a royal line would rise from Judah's descendants. This began with David and was ultimately fulfilled in Christ. Question number 3 says, for what reasons was Samuel sent to Bethlehem? Well, 2 particular reasons. He was to anoint the next king of Israel, and he was to sacrifice to the Lord. Question number 4 asks, in verse 2, was God instructing Samuel to lie? No, he wasn't. You don't necessarily lie because you don't tell everything. And then the rest of that question is, does the cause of truth require that one tell all that he knows, even though the information may cause a great deal of harm? I think the answer to that is no. In fact, if we answered everything completely all the time in order to be truthful, as we're talking about here, we would spend all our time explaining things. For example, imagine if you saw somebody today and they ask you what you did last week. If you had to be completely honest and tell everything, you couldn't leave anything out without lying, so you'd say, well, I got up at 6:13 a.m. last Monday morning, and then you would begin to give a minute-by-minute accounting for the entire week. And then if you left anything out, they could accuse you of lying. Obviously, that's ridiculous. This was God's requirement that the mission be conducted secretly. I don't believe this was either duplicity or falsehood. It was discretion and concealment, both of which are honorable. Of course, anything can be abused when man sets his mind to it, but concealment of a good purpose for a good purpose is clearly justifiable. For example, consider similar passages that deal with this idea. Exodus chapter 7, verse 16, chapter 8, verse 1, chapter 9, verse 13. These are three passages that express what God told Moses to do when he went to tell Pharaoh to release the Israelites from Egypt. Chapter 7, verse 16, he says to Moses, "Say to Pharaoh, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go," notice, "so that we may worship in the wilderness." Chapter 8, verse 1 and chapter 9, verse 13, the same request is repeated on the different occasions to Pharaoh, saying, "Let my people go so that they may worship me." Well, I've got to ask, is that all the Israelites were going to do? They were going to go worship God? And then they were going to return back to Egypt? Or were they not going to receive a law, become their own people, go to their own land, become a nation? This is a big question, and it may not answer all of your concerns, but I'm going to leave it at that. And of course, you can always contribute anything, anytime, ask anything by email, text, phone call, whatever. Be glad to discuss it with you. Question number 5 says, what kind of man was God looking for? He was looking for the kind of man who would be obedient to him. More specifically, he was looking for the kind of man that Samuel described in chapter 13, verse 14, when he said, "The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart." The next question in question 5 was, had Saul shown himself not to be such a man? Well, simply when situations got sticky, Saul would give in to pressure, he would give in to the demands of the people, he would give in to the desire for prominence. And so he was not a man who was full of integrity to the core. Question number 6 asks, how is verse 7 related to chapter 10, verses 23 and 24? Chapter 10, verses 23 and 24 says, "They ran and brought him out." This was talking about Saul when he was hiding because he didn't want to be seen by the people. "And as he stood among the people, he was a head taller than any of the others. And Samuel said to all the people, 'Do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people.' Then the people shouted, 'Long live the king.'" Obviously, Samuel had been impressed by the physical appearance of Saul, and this proved to be a mistake. The Lord is pointing that out in chapter 16, verse 7. And the question asks, does this verse mean that the man of God's choice would necessarily not be a handsome man? Based on verse 12. Well, of course not. Then he asks, what does it mean? Well, it simply means that you cannot determine one's character by looking at their outward appearance. Question number 7 asks, what 2 things happened to David? Well, Samuel anointed him with olive oil to be the king of Israel, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. Question number 8 asks, what is meant by anointed? The fundamental meaning of the word is separated or set apart. How was it done? Something was dedicated to the Lord in some way, whenever it was dedicated to the Lord in some way. That's precisely what it was. It was a dedication of that individual, that item. In this context, it was when someone was anointed with olive oil by a prophet of the Lord. Then the question is, what was its purpose? Its purpose was to set apart, to dedicate, to separate to the Lord that person or that thing for the Lord's purpose. Question number 9, how was the coming of the Spirit related to kingship? It says, see Isaiah 11 verse 2. Well, that passage is looking futuristically to the Messiah. God's purpose was always and only to have someone leading his people who was first being led by God himself, through his word, through his Spirit. Remember, for example, what God had said through Moses about the time when Israel would finally desire to have a king back in Deuteronomy chapter 17. We referred to that a few weeks ago. Verses 18 through 20 says, when the king takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. The next section, 2 short little questions here, is David and Saul brought together. Covers chapter 16 verses 14 through 23. And I'll let you pause for a minute and look over that. Question number 10 asks, what happened to Saul? Well, we're told that a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled Saul. Seems that perhaps it happened simultaneously with what occurred with David. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. By that I mean it seems likely that when the Spirit of the Lord came upon David, at the same time the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. Question number 11 asks, how did David establish a relationship with Saul? Saul's servants suggested that they find someone who could skillfully play a harp, and they found David. And of course this no doubt brought David into contact with people, which would be useful later when he was king. Others would get to know him and appreciate him for his faith in God and for his integrity. And so in this fundamental chapter here, we see that David was anointed as king because he had a heart to obey. He demonstrates his faith powerfully in the next chapter. And we see that Saul was rejected as king because he put his faith in himself more than he put his faith in God. And his disobedience was the fruit of that. Next week's class will cover chapter 17, which is the account of David and Goliath.